I didn't say a word when she threw the flowers in the dirt, didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. Just stood there in the middle of the dusty street while Margaret Hollis, the banker's wife, pearls around her neck, contempt carved into every line of her face, ground the white lilies under the heel of her boot, and said, loud enough for the whole town to hear, "Flowers don't belong on a dead woman's grave. They belong on a table where someone living can appreciate them. You're making a fool of yourself, old man, every single week." Silas Granger picked up what was left of the stems, quietly, without looking at her, and the town watched and said nothing. If you've ever loved someone so deeply that even the cruelest words in the world couldn't shake what you felt, this story is for you. Stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will change how you think about loyalty forever. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do, so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first thing people noticed about Silas Granger was that he never came to town unless he had to. That was a particular kind of statement out in Hays County, Kansas, in the autumn of 1884. Because out here, coming to town was practically the only entertainment most folks had. On a Saturday, the general store would fill up with ranch hands and homestead wives and children running between the legs of strangers, and the saloon would get loud by noon. People talked, people argued, people caught up on months of living they'd been too busy to share. Silas didn't do any of that. He came on Fridays. Only Fridays. And he came alone, on a big roan horse named Copper, who moved at the same steady pace no matter what the weather was doing, because the weather in Kansas didn't ask your permission before it made your life miserable, and neither, it seemed, did Silas Granger. He'd ride in from the northwest, which was the direction of his ranch, about 11 miles out past the creek bed that dried up every August and flooded every spring without fail. The ranch wasn't much to look at. 300 acres of good grazing land, a modest herd, a barn that leaned a little to the left but had never fully committed to falling down, and a house, small, 2 rooms, with a porch that faced west so that whoever sat on it could watch the sun go down over the plains without craning their neck. He'd owned that land for going on 14 years. He'd worked it alone for the last 7. Nobody in Hays County would have called Silas Granger an easy man to know. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, though the sun and the work had added years to his face that didn't quite belong there yet. He was tall in the way that men who've spent their whole lives on horseback are tall. A little stiff through the shoulders, a little careful with his knees when he dismounted. His hands were the kind of hands that told you everything you needed to know about a person. White across the palm, scarred across the knuckles, with a particular roughness on the right thumb from years of handling rope. He wore the same hat every Friday. Brown, wide-brimmed, with a crease down the center that had long ago become permanent. The hat had seen better days. So had the man underneath it. He would ride Copper down the center of the main street, dismount at the hitching post in front of Whitmore's flower shop, which was the only flower shop in Hays County, which made it something of a miracle that it existed at all, tie Copper with the kind of practiced knot that didn't require looking, and go inside. He never browsed. He never stood in the doorway considering his options. He walked straight to the counter and said, "Same as last week." And every week, without fail, that meant a bundle of white lilies and wild prairie roses, wrapped in brown paper, tied with a length of plain twine, nothing fancy about it. He'd pay. He'd nod. He'd walk out. And that was the entirety of Silas Granger's relationship with the town of Mill Haven, Kansas. Except that people had started to talk. It's a particular feature of small frontier communities that mystery becomes a kind of communal property. Nobody owned it, but everybody felt entitled to a piece of it. And the mystery of Silas Granger's weekly flowers had been circulating through Mill Haven for going on 3 years now, through whispered conversations at the general store, through half-formed theories exchanged over Sunday supper, through the particular kind of idle speculation that fills the hours between hard work and sleep. The theories were not in short supply. Old Pete Darrow, who had operated the livery stable since before half the current residents of Mill Haven had been born, believed Silas was sweet on a widow woman somewhere out past the county line and too proud to say so. "Man doesn't buy lilies for nobody," Pete said, with the authority of someone who had never bought lilies in his life. "He's courting somebody, too stubborn to admit it." Reverend Marsh's wife had a different interpretation. She believed the flowers were a form of penance, that Silas Granger had done something in his past that he was still working to make right, and the weekly offering was his way of settling a debt with the Almighty that he couldn't pay any other way. She said this in the kind of tone that suggested she felt both sympathetic and personally offended by the whole situation. The women at the quilting circle had approximately 11 different theories depending on the week and who had seen Silas most recently on the street. They ranged from the romantic to the tragic to the frankly improbable, and the only thing they agreed on was that it was the most interesting thing happening in Millhaven, which, given that Millhaven's primary entertainment was a saloon with a piano that was missing the F-sharp key, was not saying nothing. What everyone agreed on was this: the flowers were not for anyone in Millhaven, because nobody in Millhaven had ever received them. Silas would come in on Friday morning, buy his bouquet, tie it to Copper's saddlebag with the same careful knot he used for everything else, and ride back out the way he came. Northwest. Toward the creek and the leaning barn and the house with the westward porch. And the flowers would disappear with him. What no one had ever managed to do, what no one had quite worked up the nerve to do, because Silas Granger had a particular quality of stillness about him that made people cautious about asking direct questions, was simply walk up to the man and ask him where the flowers went. Until the Friday that changed everything. That particular Friday started the way most of them did, with the kind of flat gray sky that Kansas put on in late October, like a second skin. The wind was moving, which it always was, but moving harder than usual, coming down from the north with a bite to it that made you think twice about every decision you'd made that morning. Silas rode in at his usual time, which was somewhere between 8:30 and 9, and he tied Copper at the post with his usual knot, and he pushed open the door of Whitmore's flower shop with the familiar sound of the little brass bell above the frame. The shop was run by a woman named Adelaide Whitmore, who had inherited it from her mother and would eventually pass it to her daughter. But Adelaide had taken ill with a chest cold that had settled in and refused to leave for 3 weeks now, and so the shop on that particular Friday morning was being run by Adelaide's daughter, Hazel. Hazel Whitmore was 26 years old. She had her mother's careful hands and her father's directness, which was a combination that had served her reasonably well in life and gotten her into trouble in equal measure. She had grown up in this shop, which meant she had grown up knowing everything there was to know about what flowers meant to people. Not the sentimental version, not the poetry book version, but the actual human version. The version where a man came in 2 days after his wife left him and bought yellow roses because yellow roses were what she'd always wanted, and he'd never thought to give them to her while she was still there to receive them. The version where a mother bought carnations for a daughter she hadn't spoken to in 4 years, stood at the counter rehearsing what she was going to say, and then left without buying anything at all. Hazel Whitmore understood that flowers were rarely just flowers. She had seen Silas Granger come in every Friday for as long as she could remember. She'd watched him from the back room as a child, watched the way he stood at the counter with his hat in his hands, always took the hat off when he came inside, which her mother had noted approvingly more than once, and asked for the same thing. She had grown up watching the town talk about him. She had grown up watching nobody actually ask him anything. She was, as it happened, in the middle of wrapping a bundle of white lilies and prairie roses when the bell rang, and Silas came in that Friday morning. She looked up. He looked at her. There was a brief pause that had the quality of a small private renegotiation. The moment where two people who have never actually spoken to each other directly have to decide how they're going to interact. "Mrs. Whitmore's daughter," Silas said. It wasn't quite a question. "Hazel," she said, "Mama's not well." "Sorry to hear that." He said it the way men of his generation said those things. Briefly, genuinely, without elaboration. He moved toward the counter. "I was already wrapping yours," she said. "Same as always?" Something shifted in his expression. Too small to name, too quick to catch. "You know my order?" "You've been coming in every Friday since before I could see over this counter," she said. "I know your order." She finished wrapping the bundle, tied the twine, slid it across the counter. He reached for it, and she kept her hand on the paper just a half-second longer than she needed to. He looked at her. And Hazel Whitmore, who had spent 26 years watching this man come and go and never say more than 4 words to anyone in her mother's shop, said, "Who are they for?" The shop went very quiet. Outside, the wind pushed against the window glass, and the sign above the door creaked on its bracket. Somewhere down the street, a horse stamped and blew. Silas Granger didn't answer immediately. He didn't look away either. He stood there with his hat against his chest and his other hand resting on the brown paper package, and the silence between them had a texture to it, heavy but not hostile, more like the silence before a door opens. "My wife," he said. Hazel waited. Her name was Clara. The past tense sat in the room between them like a stone in a stream. Hazel had heard the theories. Everyone had. The widow past the county line, the penance, the courting. None of them had included this. She realized now looking at him, she'd thought the same thing as the rest of them, in some vague, unexamined way. That there was a living woman somewhere receiving these flowers. That there was a story with someone still breathing at the center of it. "Was," she said, not unkindly. 7 years ago this past March, Silas said. Fever took her. 3 days, and then she was gone. He said it plainly, not with the rehearsed flatness of someone who has learned to perform not caring, and not with the raw openness of someone for whom the wound is still fresh. He said it the way you talk about something that has been true for so long it has become part of the landscape, like saying the creek floods in spring, like saying the sun goes down in the west. Hazel looked at the bundle of white lilies and prairie roses on the counter between them. "You've been buying flowers for her grave." "Every Friday," Silas said. She liked Fridays best. Said it felt like the world was taking a breath before the weekend. Said lilies were honest flowers, and prairie roses were tough enough to mean something in this climate. A pause. Clara had opinions about flowers. Hazel felt something tighten in her chest. She sounded. She had opinions about most things. The smallest possible movement at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, not quite the memory of one. She would have had opinions about me standing here telling a stranger her business too. Would she have minded? He considered that seriously. "No," he said finally. "She was private, but she wasn't secretive. There's a difference." Hazel thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "Is that why you never told anyone? Because it felt private?" Silas looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "Nobody asked," he said simply. And that, the simple, devastating fact of it, landed somewhere in Hazel's chest and stayed there. Nobody asked. 3 years of theories, 3 years of the quilting circle, and Pete Darrow and Reverend Marsh's wife constructing elaborate explanations for something that was, at its center, the simplest and most human thing in the world. A man loved his wife died. He kept loving her. Nobody had thought to ask. He paid for the flowers. He picked up the bundle. He put his hat back on, settling it with the particular adjustment that was purely automatic. A gesture so practiced it had long since left the realm of thought. At the door he paused. Hazel wasn't sure why. She would think about that pause later, when she was alone closing up the shop, and she would wonder what he'd been deciding in that moment. He turned around. "Clara made me promise something," he said, "before she passed." Hazel waited. "She made me promise I wouldn't let the loneliness harden me." He said it carefully, like a man repeating words he has memorized because they mattered enough to be exact. She'd seen it happen to men out here, seen them lose their wives and just close. Like a fist. Said it was the loneliness doing it, not the grief. Grief was natural. Grief passed through you. Loneliness, if you let it, just filled the space grief left behind and calcified. Hazel was very still. She said the way to keep it from happening was to keep giving something to somebody, even if that somebody was already gone, because the giving was what mattered. The giving was the thing that kept you. He paused, looked for the right word with the careful patience of a man who didn't speak often and therefore spoke precisely. Open. Outside, the wind pushed at the door, and the bell above it tapped softly against the frame. "So that's what the flowers are," Silas said. "They're not for her grave, not exactly. They're for me. They're how I keep my promise." He touched the brim of his hat, the small habitual gesture that served as farewell, and walked out. Hazel stood behind the counter and listened to the bell settle and the wind take him, and she felt, with a certainty she couldn't have explained, that she had just been trusted with something that mattered. The problem, and it was, Hazel would discover over the following days, absolutely a problem, was Margaret Hollis. Margaret was the wife of Robert Hollis, who owned the only bank in Mill Haven and approximately one-third of the buildings on the main street. Margaret was not a cruel woman in the way that some cruel women are cruel, with intention, with pleasure in the cruelty. She was something more complicated and in some ways worse. She was a woman who had decided, somewhere along the way, that the world operated correctly when it conformed to her understanding of how things ought to be done. And her understanding of how things ought to be done was inflexible in the way that only things built over decades of being unchallenged can be. Margaret Hollis knew about the flowers. Of course she did. Everyone knew about the flowers. But where most people kept their theories private or limited them to the relatively contained audience of the quilting circle or the livery stable, Margaret Hollis had, at some point, decided that Silas Granger's behavior was a community matter. Hazel found out about this on the Tuesday following her conversation with Silas, when she was sweeping the walk in front of the shop, and Margaret came around the corner from the direction of the bank, with the particular purposeful stride that meant she was either going to tell you something important or tell you something you didn't want to hear, and those two categories, with Margaret, frequently overlapped. "I heard you spoke with the Granger man on Friday," Margaret said, without preamble. Millhaven was that kind of town. "I did," Hazel said, "about the flowers." "He's a customer, Mrs. Hollis. We talked." Margaret folded her hands in front of her, which was a gesture Hazel associated with the beginning of something difficult. "Hazel, I've known your mother a long time. I say this with her best interests in mind as much as yours. That man comes in here every week and buys flowers for a dead woman. Has been doing it for years. It isn't healthy, and I'm not sure it's entirely—" She paused, searching for the word. "Balanced." Hazel stopped sweeping. "He's grieving." "He's been grieving for 7 years," Margaret said, and the emphasis made it sound like a character flaw. 7 years, Hazel. My Henry's mother passed 9 years ago, and Henry doesn't send flowers to her grave every week. Nobody does that. Some people do. Some people—" Margaret stopped, recalibrated. "I'm not saying it's wrong to miss someone. I'm saying it becomes a problem when a man builds his entire life around a gesture that nobody sees and nobody benefits from. He rides out there every week alone, puts flowers on a hillside, rides back. He has no community. He has no human connection. He is, by every available measure, completely isolated." Hazel thought of Silas's hands on the brown paper bundle, the way he'd said she had opinions about flowers with that almost not a smile. "With respect, Mrs. Hollis," Hazel said, "I think you may be measuring the wrong things." Margaret's expression tightened just slightly. "I'm measuring what I can see." "That's usually the problem," Hazel said. Then before Margaret could respond, she went back to sweeping. She didn't see Margaret leave, but she felt it. The following Friday, Hazel prepared the bouquet before Silas arrived. This was a small thing. She'd been doing it for years, mechanically, the way you do any repetitive task. But this time she took a little more care. She selected the lilies herself from the morning delivery, looking for the ones with the stems that were straightest, the petals that had the cleanest edges. The prairie roses she chose for color, a deep pink that sat right on the edge of red, the color of something that meant to endure. She wrapped them in clean brown paper. She tied the twine a little more neatly than usual. When Silas came in, he stopped just inside the door the way he sometimes did, that brief pause where the interior of the shop was registered against whatever weather he'd come in from. And then he came to the counter and looked at the bundle already waiting there. He looked at Hazel. "I thought I'd be ready," she said simply. He picked up the flowers. He looked at them for a moment with that careful, precise attention he gave most things. Then he set his money on the counter. "She would have liked you," he said. Hazel didn't know what to do with that. She was surprised to find her throat tighten unexpectedly. "Based on what?" she managed. "You ask real questions," Silas said. Clara didn't have patience for the other kind. He picked up the bundle. He moved toward the door. And then, because Hazel had spent the entire week thinking about the hill to the northwest, about the grave she'd never seen, about the flowers that disappeared every Friday and what they looked like laid against prairie grass in the October wind, she said, "Mr. Granger." He stopped. "Would you mind," she said carefully, "if I came with you sometime?" The silence lasted long enough that she thought she'd overstepped, long enough that she started composing, in the back of her mind, the apology she would offer. Then Silas Granger said, "Next Friday, if the weather holds." He touched his hat brim. The bell chimed, and he was gone. Outside, the wind was picking up from the north again, rattling the window glass and moving through the dry grass along the street with a sound like whispering. Down the block, Margaret Hollis stood in front of the bank, watching the street with folded hands and an expression that had not yet become a problem, but was, Hazel understood instinctively, already becoming one. She turned back to her flowers. Next Friday, she told herself, if the weather holds. In Kansas, that was always the question. The week between that Friday and the next one was the longest week Hazel Whitmore had experienced in recent memory, and she was not a woman who typically paid much attention to the passage of time. She had work to fill it. Her mother was still unwell. The chest cold had loosened its grip slightly, but not let go entirely, which meant Adelaide Whitmore spent most of her days in the back bedroom wrapped in quilts and offering unsolicited opinions about how Hazel was running the shop from a distance of approximately 15 feet. The morning deliveries still came, the regular customers still came. Old Mrs. Prentice still came in every Wednesday for her carnations, and still spent 40 minutes telling Hazel about her daughter-in-law's many failings before purchasing the cheapest bunch in the case and leaving without a thank you. The shop ran. Hazel ran it. That was the ordinary machinery of her life, and it kept turning. But underneath it, something had shifted. She found herself thinking about what Silas had said, not the dramatic parts, not the promise, or the dead wife, or the 7 years of Fridays, but the small things. The way he'd said Clara had opinions about flowers with that fractional almost smile. The way he'd described the difference between grief and loneliness, as if he'd spent a considerable portion of 7 years working that distinction out and had finally gotten it right. The way he'd said nobody asked, without accusation, without self-pity, just as a plain observation about the way things were. She thought about that more than she expected to. She also thought about Margaret Hollis, which was a less comfortable line of thinking. On the Wednesday, Margaret came into the shop under the pretense of buying a small arrangement for the bank's front desk, something she did, Hazel estimated, roughly twice a year, and spent the better part of 20 minutes circling something she wanted to say before she said it. I've been thinking, Margaret began, which in Hazel's experience was rarely a good opening, about what you said last week. I said a few things last week. About measuring the wrong things. Margaret touched the edge of a chrysanthemum and then pulled her hand back as if reconsidering. I've been thinking about that. Hazel waited. I'm not an unfeeling person, Margaret said. I want you to understand that. I know Robert thinks, that I don't feel things the way other people do, but that isn't accurate. She paused. When I heard about the wife, that he's been going out there for 7 years, I felt something. What did you feel? Margaret looked at her. I felt sorry for him, she said, and she said it like it cost her something to admit. Which surprised me. I expected to feel, vindicated, I suppose, in my concern. But it wasn't that. It was just... She looked around the shop at things that were easier to look at than Hazel's face. It seemed very lonely. It is very lonely, Hazel said. That's rather the point. The point? He knows it's lonely. He's been living it for 7 years. He chose it anyway. Hazel set down the small pair of scissors she'd been holding. There's a difference between a man who's lonely because life put him there and a man who's lonely because he decided something was worth the cost. Silas Granger is the second kind. Margaret was quiet for a moment. You seem to know him quite well for someone who only spoke to him properly last week. I know what he told me, Hazel said, which is more than most people in this town can say. Margaret bought her arrangement, a modest one, nothing extravagant, and left without the particular purposeful stride she'd arrived with. Something in her step was more careful, more uncertain. Hazel wasn't sure if that was better or worse. She went back to work and tried not to think about Friday. She thought about Friday constantly. The weather held. That was not guaranteed in late October in Kansas. The sky had been making suggestions all week about the kind of weather it might produce if pushed. A gray heaviness in the mornings, a wind from the northwest that arrived each afternoon as if to conduct a survey of everything it might later destroy. But on Friday morning, the sky was clear and cold and flat and blue, the kind of blue that had no gentleness in it, but at least wasn't threatening anything. Hazel had the bouquet ready before the shop was properly open. She'd been in at first light, which was earlier than she needed to be and later than she'd been awake, having spent a portion of the night running through variations of a conversation she hadn't had yet with a man she barely knew. Her mother's voice from the back bedroom when Hazel came through to put the kettle on. "You're up early." "I have an early customer." "You don't open until 8. "I know when I open, Mama." A pause. The sound of Adelaide shifting in her quilts. "Is it the Granger man?" Hazel stopped moving. "How did you know?" "Because you've been distracted all week, and the only new thing that happened last Friday was him coming in and talking to you for more than 30 seconds. Adelaide's voice was rough from the cough, but precise in the way it always was. "Also, Mrs. Prentice told me you'd been making his bouquet special." "I made it carefully. There's a difference." "Hmm?" The sound Adelaide made when she was deciding whether to say more. "What did he tell you?" Hazel came to the doorway of the bedroom. Her mother looked smaller in the bed than she did behind the counter, which was always a startling recalibration. "He told me about his wife, Clara. She died 7 years ago. The flowers are for her grave." Adelaide was quiet for a moment. "I wondered," she said finally. "You never asked either." "No." Adelaide looked at her hands folded on the quilt. "Some things feel like they belong to a person, like asking would be taking something." She looked up. "Where are you going with him?" "To the grave. He said I could come." "He said you could come, or you asked if you could?" Hazel leaned against the doorframe. "I asked." Adelaide considered this. "Be careful," she said. And then, before Hazel could respond to whatever she thought that meant, "Not with him, with yourself. There's a kind of story that pulls at you, makes you want to be part of it. That's not always bad, but it's worth knowing it's happening." Hazel thought about that while the kettle came to a boil. Silas arrived at 9:05, which was slightly later than his usual time, and Hazel was beginning to wonder if he'd changed his mind when the bell above the door announced him. He came in with cold air on his coat, and the particular unhurried quality that she was beginning to understand was not indifference, but something more like patience. A man who moved at the speed his life had taught him was sustainable and had long since stopped apologizing for it. He looked at her. She had her coat on already, her scarf, the bouquet on the counter. "You're ready," he said. "I told you I would be." He looked at the flowers, really looked at them, the way he had the previous Friday. "You changed the roses." Hazel glanced at the bundle. "I chose deeper color ones this week, more pink. I thought, in this light, out on the prairie, they'd carry better." Silas picked up the bouquet. He turned it slightly in his large hands, examining the angle she'd tied the twine. Clara would have called that practical. "Is that a compliment?" "From Clara, yes." He set the flowers down and reached into his coat pocket for his money. For most people she knew, practical meant something closer to unromantic. Clara thought that was backwards. She said if you couldn't be practical about the things that mattered, you didn't actually understand how much they mattered. Hazel picked up her gloves from behind the counter. "She sounds like someone worth knowing." Silas said nothing for a moment. He put his money on the counter without counting it. He always put exactly the right amount, which meant he always had it ready, which meant he thought about this before he arrived, and somehow that detail undid something in Hazel's chest. "She was," he said, "the best person I've known in my life, and I'm not saying that because she's gone. I said it when she was alive too. She knew I thought it." A pause. "I want you to know that because some people hear about a man going to his wife's grave every week and they think he's doing it from guilt. I want to be clear that I'm not." Hazel pulled on her left glove, then her right. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because you're coming with me," Silas said simply. "And I'd rather you understood what you're coming to." He picked up the flowers. He held the door. She locked the shop. Her mother would rest, wouldn't need to be on her feet, and stepped out into the cold October morning, and they walked together to the hitching post where Copper stood with the resigned patience of a horse who had made peace with a great deal. Silas had brought a second horse, a bay mare, older, with white around her muzzle, and the expression of an animal who had seen most things and formed opinions about them. She was already saddled. Hazel looked at the mare. "You planned this." "You said you wanted to come," Silas said, swinging up onto Copper with the practiced economy of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "Seemed inconsiderate to make you walk 11 miles. Hazel almost laughed. Almost. She gathered the mare's reins and mounted with somewhat less elegance. She could ride, had ridden since childhood, but not recently and not often, and the mare registered her inexperience with a small sideways step that was more commentary than complaint. "What's her name?" Hazel asked. "Patience," Silas said. Hazel looked at him. "Clara named her," he said. Said it was a virtue the horse had more of than most people she knew. They rode northwest out of Mill Haven, past the grain store and the feed yard, and the last few buildings that constituted the edge of town, and then the town was behind them, and there was just the prairie, flat and enormous, and the color of old straw, stretching to a horizon that seemed further away than any horizon had a right to be. They didn't talk for the first mile or so, and the silence wasn't uncomfortable. That surprised Hazel, who had expected it to be, had half-rehearsed things to say to fill it. But the land had a quality that made conversation feel like something to be considered carefully rather than rushed into, and Silas moved through it with an ease that suggested he and this stretch of Kansas had long since come to terms with each other. It was Hazel who broke it first. "How long have you been on the ranch?" 14 years, Silas said. "We came out from Ohio, Clara and I, 1870. He rode with his reins loose, barely holding them, which was the mark of a man who trusted his horse completely. I'd been telling her for 2 years that we ought to go west, that there was land out there that cost almost nothing and could become something. She thought I was chasing a story I'd read somewhere. "Were you?" "Probably," he said. "Most men who go west are chasing something they read somewhere. Doesn't mean what they find is wrong, just means it's different from what they expected." Hazel watched a hawk move along the tree line to the east, riding the thermals with the effortless patience of something that had never needed to hurry. "What did you find?" "Hard ground," Silas said. "Cold winters that were colder than anyone told you. 2 drought years in the first 5. A barn that cost twice what the lumberman quoted and took 6 weeks longer than he said it would." He paused. "And mornings. There are mornings out here, when the light comes up a certain way across the plains, that make you understand why people came, even if they can't explain it." "Clara," Hazel said. "Did she understand it, eventually?" "She understood it before I did." He said it with a kind of rueful directness. "She'd been right to be skeptical of my reasons, and she turned out to love the place more purely than I did, because she got there without the story I'd been telling myself. She just looked at it and decided she loved it. Clara was like that. She didn't need a narrative, she just needed the thing itself." They rode in silence for a little while after that. Patience moved beneath Hazel steadily, with the careful, deliberate gait of a horse that had walked this ground many times and knew where it was going. "She got sick in the winter," Silas said, after a time. He didn't offer it as a continuation of anything. It arrived as facts sometimes do, when a person has been carrying them long enough that they start to come out sideways between other things. February. The snow had been bad that year. We'd been snowed in for close on 3 weeks. When she started coughing, I thought it was the cold, the dry air, the same cough half the county had every February. Hazel said nothing. She understood that some things required listening to, not responding to. "It wasn't," Silas said. "It went to her chest. Then it went deeper. By the time we could get the doctor out from Millhaven, there wasn't much he could tell us that we didn't already know." He looked ahead along the trail, at nothing in particular. "She lasted 3 days after that. The doctor said she wasn't in pain at the end. I don't know if that was true or if it was the kind of thing doctors say. I chose to believe it." Hazel thought about what her mother had said that morning. Some things feel like they belong to a person. She said, "Did you have time to talk before she went?" Silas looked at her briefly, with an expression that was difficult to read. "That's a better question than most people would ask. You don't have to answer it." "No, He stopped. Started again. "Yes. We had the 3 days. And Clara was the kind of woman who didn't waste time when time was what she was running short of. She told me what she wanted me to know. And I told her." He was quiet for a moment. "Most of it, anyway. I think you always believe there'll be more time to say the last small things. And then the time is gone and the small things are still in your chest somewhere, not said." Hazel felt that in a very specific part of herself that she couldn't have named. "What kind of small things?" "The daily kind," Silas said. "The things you'd have said at supper on an ordinary evening. The funny things that happened with the cattle. A bird you saw. The way the creek looked that morning." He shifted his weight in the saddle. things that felt too small to use the time for when the time was running out. But those were the things she'd have wanted to know. She loved the ordinary things. She said they were what a life was actually made of. Hazel looked at the bouquet tied to Copper's saddlebag, the white lilies and the deep pink prairie roses moving gently with the horse's gait. "That's why you tell her," she said slowly. "When you go, you tell her the small things." Silas looked at her. "The things you'd have said at supper," Hazel said. "The calves born this week, the fence that needed fixing, the way the creek looked." He was quiet for a long moment. "Every Friday," he said, finally. "What?" The hill appeared after about an hour of riding. Not dramatic, not the kind of hill that announced itself. It rose gradually out of the flat land, a low swell in the prairie with a single oak standing at its crest, old enough that its trunk had the gnarled, decided quality of something that had made peace with its own persistence. From its base, looking south, you could see the land roll away toward the horizon in all directions, the dry grass pale and enormous, the sky above it a cold, precise blue. Silas dismounted. He untied the bouquet from Copper's saddlebag carefully, the same care he used for everything that mattered. He didn't rush. He didn't perform the moment. Hazel dismounted from Patience and looped the reins around a low branch. She hung back slightly. This felt important, not to crowd what was about to happen, not to make it about her presence. She was a witness. She understood that much. The grave was simple. A flat stone, not large, set into the earth at the crest of the hill beside the oak's roots. The stone had Clara's name on it, and the years, and below them a sentence that Hazel had to move a little to read. She loved the ordinary things. Hazel stopped moving. She stood there reading those 4 words, and something happened in her that she hadn't anticipated and couldn't stop. A tightening behind her eyes, a fullness in her throat that she hadn't earned and hadn't expected and couldn't entirely explain. Silas crouched beside the stone. He set the flowers down, not hurriedly, not casually, but with the same deliberate attention he brought to everything, leaning them against the base of the stone so they'd stay. Then he was quiet for a moment. Then he started talking. He talked to Clara the way Hazel had talked to her mother when she was 12 years old, and her mother had gone to her sister's house for 2 weeks, and Hazel had been at home alone for the first time in her life, just out loud, to the empty room, because the talking was what kept the silence from becoming something worse. He talked about the week, a calf born 3 days ago, red and small and determined, the north fence line that had been giving him trouble since August, and had finally, this week, accepted the new posts. A fox he'd seen near the barn 2 mornings running, bold enough to sit in the open and look at him without moving. The first frost on the grass. A dream he'd had about the farm in Ohio that he couldn't remember clearly, but had woken with the feeling of. He talked about small things. Hazel stood 30 feet away and felt the weight of 7 years of small things. Every Friday, all the ordinary accumulation of a life lived fully and in detail, and with no one to tell it to except this stone on this hill, and she understood, more completely than she had standing in the shop last week, more completely than she had riding here this morning, what Clara's promise had actually cost him to keep. Not the riding, not the buying of flowers, not even the talking, the not forgetting, the choosing every single week to notice the small things and save them up so they could be told. Because noticing required feeling. And feeling, when you were alone on a windswept ranch for 7 years with no one to share what you noticed with, was a harder discipline than anything the prairie had thrown at Silas Granger. Harder than the drought years. Harder than the cold. He had kept himself open, the way Clara asked him to. It had cost him enormously, in ways that didn't show. He stood up after a while. He adjusted his hat. He looked at the flowers against the stone for a moment, checking, Hazel thought, that they were positioned right, that they'd stay. Then he turned and walked back to where she was standing, and he looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him pause. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." She wasn't entirely, but she would be. She looked at the stone, at the 4 words. She loved the ordinary things. "Did you write that?" "I did." "It's the right thing," Hazel said. "For her. It's exactly the right thing." Silas looked at the stone for a moment. "I almost didn't. I almost put something longer, something that sounded more like what you're supposed to put." He paused. But Clara would have hated that. She had no patience for language that tried to be more than what it meant. Hazel laughed, a small sound, surprised out of her. Sounds like something she'd say. Word for word, Silas said. She said it about sermons, mostly, but it applied broadly. They stood there together in the cold, looking at the grave and the flowers and the oak above it, and the wind moved through the grass on the hill with that dry, whispering sound, and the horses stood patiently together near the branch. Thank you, Hazel said, for letting me come. Silas was quiet for a moment. Clara would have liked you, he said for the second time, and then, before Hazel could respond to that, she would have said you ask real questions, and you know when not to ask them. She would have said that was rare. Hazel looked at him. He was watching the horizon with the particular stillness that she was beginning to recognize as his natural state. Not closed, not cold, just very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with having nothing to say. Can I ask one more? She said. He didn't turn to look at her. Probably. Are you lonely? She said it directly because she was her father's daughter, and Margaret Hollis aside, directness was the only mode she trusted. Not grieving, lonely. The pause was long enough that she thought she might have miscalculated. Yes, Silas said. He said it without apology, without drama, without any particular quality except honesty. Some days more than others. Some weeks I don't think about it. Some weeks I ride into town to buy flowers, and the whole ride back yes. He looked at the grave. But I made Clara a promise. And the thing about a promise to somebody who isn't there to release you from it is that you have to decide every day whether it's still worth keeping. Not because someone's watching, just because you said you would. He finally looked at her. Most days I decide it is. Hazel held his gaze. Most days? I'm not going to tell you it's always easy, Silas said. You asked a real question. That's the real answer. She nodded. She looked back at the grave. They stood there a few minutes longer, not talking, while the wind moved across the hill and the light shifted and the horses breathed their slow, patient breath beside the oak tree. Then Silas said, We should head back. Weather'll turn by afternoon. He was right. She could feel it, the way the wind had changed its angle just slightly, the way the blue at the north edge of the sky had gone a shade darker. They rode back toward Millhaven mostly in silence, which was a different silence from the one on the way out. That silence had been two people who didn't know each other well. This one was two people who had been handed, briefly, a view of something true, and were still making room for it. Yay! Millhaven came back into view around midday. The grain store first, then the feed yard, then the line of buildings along the main street, resolving out of the prairie like something reluctant to be arrived at. They rode in together, which was unusual, which was, Hazel understood the moment they turned onto the main street, going to be noticed. And it was. Pete Darrow was in front of the livery stable. He didn't say anything, but he watched with the particular alertness of a man updating a theory in real time. Two women from the quilting circle were coming out of the general store, and they stopped, and one said something to the other behind her hand. Hazel kept her eyes forward. She thought she saw, out of the corner of her eye, the door of the bank open slightly, and the pale face of Margaret Hollis at the gap. At the flower shop, they both dismounted. Silas took Patience's reins without being asked and looped them over the post beside Copper. Thank you, he said, for the company. Hazel looked at him. Same time next week? Something changed in his face. Not large. She was already learning that nothing changed large in Silas Granger's face. But it changed. If you want to come, he said, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, Hazel said. I'm asking because I want to. He looked at her for a moment. Then he touched his hat brim. Same time next week. He mounted Copper. He rode northwest out of town, past the grain store and the last buildings, until the prairie took him, and the horizon closed behind him like water. Hazel stood on the walk in front of her mother's shop and watched him go, and she was aware of the eyes on her from the quilting circle, from Pete Darrow's direction, from wherever Margaret Hollis was watching, and she found she didn't particularly care. She thought about a stone on a hill. She thought about 4 words carved into it by a man who had understood exactly what they meant. She thought about small things saved up and spoken out loud to someone who could no longer hear them, except that she wasn't sure that was true. She wasn't sure the speaking wasn't its own kind of hearing. She thought about the difference between grief and loneliness, and the particular courage of choosing not to let the second one win. And she thought, not for the first time but more clearly than before, about her mother's warning, about the kind of story that pulls at you, makes you want to be part of it. She went inside the shop. The bell rang above her. The smell of cut flowers and cold water and earth met her, familiar and steadying. She hung her coat. She put on her apron. She had 3 hours left in the workday, and Patience's steady gait was still in her legs, and the image of white lilies against a gravestone was somewhere behind her eyes, where it would stay for a long time. From the back bedroom, her mother's voice. How was it? Hazel thought about how to answer that, thought about everything she'd seen and everything she'd heard, and the hawk riding thermals above the tree line, and the way Silas had said most days without flinching. It was real, she said finally. A pause from the back bedroom, then, good, that's the most you can ask for. Hazel picked up her scissors. She had a delivery to prepare. Outside, the sky at the north edge was darkening, the way Silas had said it would. The afternoon weather was making good on its suggestion, and somewhere to the northwest, a man on a roan horse was riding home across 11 miles of prairie with empty hands and whatever lived in his chest that the flowers were keeping alive. She cut the first stem. She worked. The weather turned that afternoon, as Silas said it would, and it stayed turned for the better part of 2 weeks. Not the dramatic, operatic kind of Kansas weather that people wrote home about. Not tornadoes or the kind of thunderstorm that took out fences and left cattle scattered across 3 counties. Just the gray, grinding, relentless kind. Low clouds that settled in like an unwelcome house guest and showed no indication of leaving. Rain that wasn't quite heavy enough to be satisfying, but was exactly heavy enough to make every outdoor task miserable. The temperature dropped in the kind of gradual, committed way that told you winter wasn't threatening anymore. It had made its decision and was already moving in. The Friday that followed their ride to the hill came and went without Silas. Hazel told herself it was the weather. She told herself he was a practical man and 11 miles on a muddy trail. In cold rain was nobody's idea of a reasonable undertaking, even for a man who had been doing it every week for 7 years. She arranged the bouquet anyway, white lilies, prairie roses, the deep pink ones, and set it in water at the back of the shop and waited until the afternoon light started failing before she quietly dismantled it and put the individual stems back where they belonged. Her mother, from the back bedroom. He didn't come. No. Weather. That's what I said. Adelaide appeared in the doorway, which she was doing more frequently now that the cold had given some ground. She was still wrapped in a shawl, but she was upright, which was progress. You look like you're trying not to look like you're disappointed. I'm not disappointed, Hazel said, which was partly true. She was something, but she wasn't sure disappointed was exactly the right word for it. It was more like the feeling when you've been carrying a question for a week and the person who could answer it didn't show up. Not personal, just unresolved. He'll come next week, Adelaide said. I know. Or the week after. Mama. Adelaide went back to bed. Hazel finished closing the shop. She thought about the grave on the hill, with no flowers on it this week. She thought about what that meant to a man who hadn't missed a Friday in 7 years. She thought about whether he sat on his westward-facing porch in the rain and felt the absence of the ritual like a missed step on a staircase, your body expecting solid ground and finding nothing. She thought about that more than was probably warranted. The second Friday was worse, because the weather had cleared on Wednesday, which meant she had 2 full days of expectation built up before 9 o'clock Friday morning, and by 8:45 she had straightened every bucket of flowers in the shop twice, and was on the verge of starting a third time when the bell above the door rang. Silas came in with cold on his coat and something careful in his face that she hadn't seen before. You missed last week, she said. She hadn't planned to say it that directly, but there it was. I know. He came to the counter. He looked at the bouquet that was already there. Trail was bad. I figured. He looked at her. The flowers. I couldn't get in, so He stopped. Reached into his coat pocket and produced something. A handful of stems, prairie roses mostly, the wild ones that grew along the fence lines of his property, tied with a bit of wire because he'd had no twine. They were battered from the pocket, and half the petals had given up, and they were nothing like the careful bundles she prepared for him each week. I cut these from the fence line, he said. Rode up to the hill on foot when the trail was still too muddy for copper. Took me an hour. I know they're... He looked at the stems in his hand. They weren't much by the time I got there. Hazel looked at the battered roses. She looked at him. You walked, she said. Couldn't leave it. It was already a week late. He set the stems on the counter, not quite sure what to do with them now that he'd shown them. I know it probably sounds... It doesn't sound like anything except what it is, Hazel said. She picked up the stems. The wire was tight around them, the kind of knot a man ties when he's working with whatever's available and doesn't have time to be precise. I'll put these in water. They're mostly done. They're not done until I say they're done. She set them in a short jar with water and moved them to the window ledge where the light was best. They did look rough, but they were still standing, most of them, which under the circumstances felt like a significant achievement. She turned back to Silas. She slid the prepared bouquet across the counter. This week's, she said. He looked at it. He looked at her. He paid without counting the money, the way he always did. He picked up the bundle. Same time next week, he said. I'll have your coat ready to go, Hazel said. Something moved in his face. Not a smile exactly. More like the territory adjacent to one. Adelaide well enough to mind the shop. She's well enough to have opinions about how I mind it. So yes. This time it was closer to a smile. Not much, but measurable. They went back the following Friday, and the Friday after that, and by the time December settled in with its particular brand of iron gray intention, the ride to the hill had become a thing with its own rhythm. Hazel would have the bouquet ready. Silas would arrive at 9:05, which was always 9:05, which she had come to understand was not lateness, but the precise amount of time it took Copper to cover the distance from the ranch at his natural pace. They would ride out northwest together, and Hazel would listen and sometimes ask questions and sometimes say nothing at all, and Silas would talk to Clara about the week's ordinary things, and then they would ride back. It was simple. It was the most uncomplicated friendship Hazel had ever had, partly because Silas had no interest in performance, and partly because the ritual at its center was too honest to allow for pretense around it. What was less simple was Millhaven. The town had been watching. Small towns have a metabolism of their own, a way of processing new information through every available channel simultaneously, so that by the time something becomes official knowledge, it has already been semi-official knowledge for weeks, worked over and worried at, and turned in people's hands, until the original fact has accrued a significant amount of additional material that may or may not bear any relationship to what actually happened. The original fact, in this case, was that Hazel Whitmore had been seen riding out of town with Silas Granger on a Friday morning and returning with him at midday. This had happened multiple times. People had drawn conclusions. Pete Darrow's theory had evolved significantly. I was no longer convinced Silas was courting a widow past the county line. He had pivoted to the position that Silas was now courting Hazel Whitmore, which Pete considered a natural development and discussed with anyone who stood still long enough at the livery stable. The quilting circle had fractured into two distinct camps, those who found the whole arrangement romantic and those who found it troubling, and the border between the two camps shifted depending on who was doing the talking and what mood they were in. Reverend Marsh had stopped speculating publicly, which in Hazel's experience meant he was speculating privately with considerably more energy. And Margaret Hollis had gone quiet, which was the thing that Hazel found most difficult to account for. Margaret's particular mode of community concern tended to be vocal. The silence didn't read like resolution. It read like something being considered. Hazel noticed all of this in the peripheral way that you notice weather building on the horizon, aware of it, but focused on what's directly in front of you. What was directly in front of her, on the third Friday of December, was a problem. She'd been in early, as usual. The delivery had come before 7, and she'd gone through it and discovered that the lilies were wrong. Not wrong in the catastrophic sense, but wrong enough. The stems were shorter than she'd ordered, which meant they'd been cut early, which meant they'd likely started their decline before they'd arrived, which meant they might not make it to the hill and back without the petals going heavy and loose in a way that wouldn't be right. She was standing at the back counter examining them, pressing the base of a stem with 2 fingers to check the firmness, when the shop door opened. She assumed it was Silas. She didn't look up. I need to tell you something about the lilies this week. I'm not Silas Granger. Hazel looked up. Margaret Hollis stood inside the door, without her usual purposeful stride, without the folded hands. She looked, for the first time in Hazel's experience of her, uncertain. She was carrying something, a small paper bag from the general store, which was a prop. Hazel understood instantly, something to have in her hands. Mrs. Hollis. I'm not here to buy anything, Margaret said, which made the bag somewhat more obviously a prop. I wanted to... She stopped, looked around the shop in the way people look around rooms when they're trying to decide how to begin something they've been working up to for some time. I've been thinking. You said that last time. Yes, well. Margaret moved toward the counter, not quite reaching it. I went to see him. Hazel went still. I'm sorry? Silas Granger. I rode out to his ranch. She said it with the particular quality of someone confessing something. 2 weeks ago. I had something I needed to say to him. Hazel set down the lily stem she was holding. She gave Margaret her full attention. What did you say? Margaret was quiet for a moment. In that moment, Hazel saw something she hadn't expected to see in Margaret Hollis's face. Genuine difficulty. Not the difficulty of someone who was wrong and knew it and wouldn't admit it. The other kind. The kind where the thing you need to say doesn't have comfortable words. I told him what I'd done, Margaret said, with the flowers. That Friday on the street. I told him it was... She stopped. I told him it was unforgivable, what I did. I used that word deliberately. And he said... She paused again. Her grip on the paper bag shifted. He said, Mrs. Hollis, Clara would have had a few things to say to you, and then she'd have found a way to let it go, because that was her way, and I'm still working on learning it, but I'm getting there. Hazel was quiet for a moment. She thought about Silas saying that. She could hear it in his voice, the exact cadence of it, careful and precise, and without the comfort of easy forgiveness, but without cruelty either. That sounds like him, she said. I know. Margaret set the paper bag on the counter. Her hands were, Hazel noticed, not quite steady. I've been going to that store for 23 years, she said. Robert and I have lived in this town that long. And I realized, sitting across from that man in his kitchen, Hazel, he made me coffee. He didn't have to do that. The man I'd humiliated on a public street made me coffee. I realized I'd spent 23 years deciding what things meant about people without asking the people what they meant. Hazel said, That's a hard thing to realize. It is, Margaret said. She didn't make it smaller than it was. He told me about Clara. Not everything, I think, but enough. He told me about the promise. She looked at Hazel directly. You've been going with him, on Fridays. I have. Does it help him, having company? Hazel thought about that honestly. Not about what would be the right answer or the reassuring answer, but about what she actually believed. I think it helps and doesn't help at the same time, she said. The going to the grave, the talking to Clara, that's his. I don't participate in that. I just ride with him, and I listen on the way there and on the way back, and I think the listening is the part that matters. He's been storing up small things with no one to tell them to. Margaret looked at the lily stems on the back counter. I didn't know she existed, she said, before last week. Clara. I'd heard there'd been a wife. I didn't... She shook her head. She loved the ordinary things. That's what it says on her stone? That's what it says. Margaret picked up her paper bag. She looked at it as if she'd forgotten what was in it. I want to ask you something, and I need you to tell me if I'm overstepping. Hazel waited. I'd like to contribute to the flowers, Margaret said. I don't want to make a show of it. I don't want credit. She set the bag back down. I broke the flowers once. I want to have been part of putting them back. Hazel looked at her for a long moment. I'll tell Silas you asked, she said. It's not my decision to make. Margaret nodded. That's fair. She picked up the bag. I'll wait to hear. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. She must have been something, she said. Clara. To make a man like that. I think it was more that she brought out what was already in him, Hazel said. That's what it sounds like to me. Margaret Hollis opened the door and went out into the cold December morning, and the bell settled behind her, and Hazel stood with the inadequate lilies on her back counter and the full, complicated weight of what had just happened. She told Silas on his ride out that Friday. Not at the beginning. She let the town fall behind them, and the prairie open up before she said anything, because she'd learned by now that certain things needed space around them before you put them into words. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. When she'd finished, he was quiet for a bit. The horses moved, the grass was winter dry and pale. A skein of geese passed overhead going south, their honking faint and then gone. "She came to the ranch," he said finally. Not a question. 2 weeks ago, apparently. She said you made her coffee. Silas was quiet for another moment. Seemed like the thing to do. It was cold. She'd ridden out. A pause. She cried a little, didn't want to, tried to hide it. Did she? Not really. He shifted in the saddle. I felt sorry for her. That surprised me. She said something similar, about you. He processed that. She wants to give money for the flowers. She wants to contribute. She was clear she doesn't want it to be a production. Silas said nothing for long enough that Hazel thought he might have decided not to answer. Then, Clara would have said, take the money. Not because we need it, but because it costs Margaret something to offer it, and refusing a real cost isn't generosity. He adjusted his grip on Copper's reins. She also would have said to make sure Margaret understood this isn't about the flowers. The flowers are just the way the thing looks on the outside. What's the thing on the inside? He looked at her sideways. Keeping a promise, he said. That's all it ever was. It was on the 5th or 6th Friday of riding together. Hazel had stopped counting with any precision because the Fridays had become their own kind of time, distinct from the regular week's measure. That the trouble started in a form she hadn't anticipated. It came from the direction she should have seen and didn't, partly because she'd been watching Margaret and partly because she'd been watching Silas. And the thing with paying attention to two things at once is that it usually means you're missing a third. The third thing was a man named Clem Darby. Clem Darby was 29 years old and worked as a clerk at Robert Hollis's bank and had, for approximately the past year, made his interest in Hazel Whitmore known through a series of increasingly unsubtle gestures that Hazel had been deflecting with the particular skill of a woman who is practiced at not directly refusing someone she has to see regularly in a town with limited social exit routes. Clem was not cruel. He was not Margaret Hollis. He wasn't even unpleasant exactly. He was the kind of young man whose confidence had slightly outrun his self-awareness, who had decided at some point that persistence was the same thing as devotion, and who therefore could not distinguish between the two when he was doing it. He had been watching the Fridays. He came into the shop on a Tuesday, which was not his usual day. He came in on occasional Thursdays for small bouquets that Hazel understood were meant to be given to her, and which she graciously received and put in water, where they sat until she quietly removed them. On this Tuesday, he came in with an expression she'd learned to associate with a prepared speech. I need to ask you something, he said. Hello, Clem. She kept working. She'd found, with Clem, that continuing to work made conversations shorter. I've been seeing you ride out on Fridays with Silas Granger. He said the name with a particular intonation. Not quite contempt, not quite concern. Something younger than either. Something closer to wounded. I visit the ranch with him, Hazel said. This was the version she offered in public, which was technically accurate. The grave felt private in the way that Adelaide had described last month, like something that belonged to Silas, not to the town's curiosity. Why? She set down her scissors. She looked at him directly because she owed him that. He lost his wife 7 years ago, Clem. He goes out there alone every week. I keep him company. He doesn't need... Clem stopped, started again. He's a grown man. He's been doing it alone for 7 years. He doesn't need you to... I think that's his decision, don't you? I think... Clem's jaw tightened. He was working at staying reasonable, which she could see was costing him. I think you're spending every Friday with a man who's twice your age and has nothing to offer you, and the whole town is talking about it. Hazel looked at him carefully. The whole town talked about him for 3 years before anyone bothered to ask what the flowers meant, she said. I'm not very interested in what the whole town thinks. Clem's face did something complicated. I'm not talking about the flowers, he said. I'm talking about... Hazel, I've been... He stopped. The prepared speech had run into something it hadn't prepared for. I've been trying to let you know how I feel about you for the better part of a year, and you're spending every Friday with someone else. Hazel felt the particular tiredness of having a conversation she'd been hoping to not have. "Clem," she said carefully, "I understand that, and I don't want to be unkind, but what I do on Fridays has nothing to do with how I feel about you. Those are two separate things." "They don't feel separate." "I know they don't." She picked her scissors back up because the conversation needed to be shorter than it was becoming. "Come back when you want to buy flowers," she said. "I'll always be glad to help you with that." He left, and she went back to work. And she told herself she'd handled it and believed it for about 20 minutes before she admitted, in the quieter part of her mind, that Clem Darby going away unhappy in a town this small was the beginning of something and not the end of it. She was right about that. The following Friday, Silas arrived at 9:05 and found three things: the bouquet ready on the counter, Hazel in her coat and scarf, and Clem Darby standing on the walk outside the shop with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the look of a man who has decided that witnessing something directly is better than imagining it. Silas registered Clem with the same quiet attention he gave most things: a single look, a recalibration. He looked at Hazel. "Ready?" "Ready," she said. She came out. She mounted Patience, who accepted her weight with the same measured patience as always. Silas mounted Copper. Clem watched all of this without speaking. They rode past him. Hazel did not look at him, which was its own kind of communication. Silas also did not look at him, which was a different kind. They were 2 blocks out before Silas said quietly, "Friend of yours?" "He'd like to be more than that," Hazel said. "He hasn't quite accepted that the answer is no." Silas thought about that. "Is the answer no because of Fridays?" Hazel looked at him. "The answer is no because it's no. Fridays are a separate question." He nodded, accepting this, and they rode on. But Hazel thought, for the rest of the ride out, about the fact that Clem would report what he'd seen to whoever would listen, which in Millhaven was everyone, and that by next week the conversation would have shifted from vague speculation about Silas Granger's flowers to something more pointed and less kind directed at her. She knew this. She knew it the way you know weather. She rode through it anyway, because the hill was ahead, and the flowers were in Copper's saddlebag, and Silas was talking about a heifer who'd decided the south pasture wasn't adequate and had been methodically dismantling the fence between it and the north pasture for 2 weeks. And he said it with a kind of exhausted admiration for the animal's persistence that made Hazel laugh out loud. A real laugh, not a polite one. And Patience's ears swiveled back at the sound and then forward again. And when they reached the hill and Silas crouched beside the stone and began talking to Clara about the week, Hazel stood at her usual distance and looked at the December sky above the oak tree, hard and pale and enormous, and felt underneath the worry about Clem Darby and the town's talk and the inadequate lilies from last week, something that was difficult to name but that she'd started to recognize. It was the feeling of being in the right place, not a romantic feeling, not simple, more like the feeling of a door that's been stuck and then opens, the mild shock of air from the other side, and then the ordinary light of wherever you've been trying to get to. She stood on the hill in December and breathed the cold air and waited, and Silas finished talking to Clara and adjusted the flowers against the stone, and stood up and looked at the horizon the way he always did before he turned to come back. "Thank you," he said, as he always did. "You stopped thanking me," Hazel said. "It's been 2 months." He turned to look at her. "Clara would have said gratitude doesn't expire," he said. "She said people stop saying thank you because they get comfortable, and getting comfortable is how you stop seeing what someone's actually doing for you." Hazel thought about that. She was right. She was right about most things. He untied the horses. She was wrong about the fence posts in the south pasture. Thought 8 feet was too deep. I put them in at 10, and she said I was being stubborn, and I said I'd rather be stubborn than replace fence posts in 2 years. He handed Patience's reins to Hazel. She never actually admitted I was right about that, but she stopped mentioning the depth. Hazel mounted. "That's its own kind of right." "That's what I told her." A pause. "About 40 times. They rode back toward Millhaven in the pale December light, and the wind was at their backs, and the town appeared on the horizon and grew slowly larger, the way towns do when you're approaching them from a long way off, reluctant and inevitable at the same time. She didn't know, riding in that afternoon, that the next Friday would be the one that broke something open. That Clem Darby had spent the intervening week talking, and that what he'd been saying had traveled further and faster than she'd accounted for, and that one particular piece of it had reached a set of ears she hadn't considered in her calculations. She didn't know that Silas had a brother. She didn't know the brother was coming. She rode into Millhaven in the December cold and put Patience in Pete Darrow's livery. Pete took the reins without comment, which was its own form of progress, and walked back to the shop in the early falling dark. Her mother was at the counter for the first time in weeks, upright and aproned, rearranging a bucket of Christmas holly with the critical eye of a woman who has been confined to bed too long and has opinions about holly that have been building for some time. "Letter came," Adelaide said, without looking up. "For you, from out of town." She nodded toward the counter. Hazel picked it up. The handwriting was sharp and forward-leaning, the kind of handwriting that suggested urgency or impatience or both. The return address was from a town she didn't recognize, 2 counties east. She opened it. She read it once. Then again, because the first time through it didn't quite arrange itself into something she could fully understand. It was from a man named Harlan Granger. He described himself as Silas's younger brother. He had heard, he wrote, that his brother had formed an attachment to a woman in Millhaven, and he was coming to assess the situation. He did not use the word interfere. He came close enough. He would arrive, he said, next Friday. Hazel put the letter down on the counter. Her mother looked up. "What is it?" Hazel looked at the letter. She looked at the dark window where the cold outside was beginning to put frost on the lower edges of the glass. She thought about a man she'd known now for 2 months and an entire town's worth of talk and a grave on a hill with 4 carved words and a promise made to someone who couldn't enforce it anymore. "A complication," she said. Adelaide looked at the letter. She looked at Hazel's face. She picked up her holly and considered it. "Most things worth having," Adelaide said, "come with at least one." Hazel didn't tell Silas about the letter right away. She told herself this was because she needed to understand it better before she could explain it to someone else, which was partly true. She also told herself she didn't want to trouble him with something that might amount to nothing. A letter was just a letter. Harlan Granger hadn't arrived yet, and a man writing that he was coming to assess a situation and a man actually arriving to do it were 2 different things separated by a considerable distance that might, for any number of reasons, remain uncrossed. She told herself these things, and she believed them to the extent you believe things you've constructed to be believable. The part she didn't tell herself, because she was honest enough not to bother lying to herself about it, was this. She didn't know how Silas would react, and not knowing how Silas would react to something meant she couldn't prepare for it, and not being able to prepare for something was a condition Hazel Whitmore had never made her peace with. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer beneath the counter, where she kept the twine and the small scissors and the order book, and she went back to work, and she did not take it out again until Thursday evening. Thursday evening, she sat at the kitchen table above the shop. She and Adelaide lived in the 2 rooms above, which smelled permanently of cut flowers and wood smoke. And she read the letter a 3rd time, and then a 4th, which didn't tell her anything the 3rd hadn't, but which she conducted anyway on the theory that additional readings might reveal something useful. Harlan Granger wrote in the manner of a man who was accustomed to having his concerns treated as legitimate and his assessments taken seriously. He was, he said, the only family Silas had. He had been trying for years to get Silas to leave the Kansas ranch, which Harlan considered an act of stubborn self-punishment masquerading as loyalty to a dead woman, and come east to Harlan's farm in Missouri, where there was room and where Silas wouldn't have to work himself alone into his grave on land that held nothing but grief. He had written letters to this effect. Silas had not responded to them with anything approaching receptiveness. Now he had heard, through a letter from someone in Millhaven, he did not say who, that Silas had formed an attachment to a young woman who was accompanying him on his weekly rituals, and Harlan was concerned. Not, he was careful to say, about the woman herself, whom he did not know. About Silas. About a man in his mid-40s who had spent 7 years in voluntary isolation, making weekly visits to a grave, being influenced by someone new without anyone looking out for his interests. That phrase, looking out for his interests, was the one Hazel returned to. She sat with it and turned it over and tried to decide if it was sinister or merely overbearing, and concluded it was probably both. Adelaide, from her chair by the stove, "You've read that 4 times. I'm thinking. You're avoiding." Hazel folded the letter. His brother thinks I'm influencing him. Are you? I'm keeping him company, Hazel said. That's all I've ever done. Adelaide looked at her steadily. Adelaide Whitmore had spent 30 years reading the faces of people who came into her shop under the pretense of buying flowers, and actually under the pressure of something else entirely, and she was not easy to mislead. That's all? She said. Hazel was quiet for a moment. He's my friend, she said. I didn't plan it. It just became true. Friendships generally do. Adelaide set down her mending. What are you afraid the brother's going to say? I'm afraid he's going to say that I've attached myself to a grieving man and muddied something that was clean. Has it been clean? Yes. She said it without hesitation. It has been. And then, because Adelaide was looking at her with that particular quality of attention that required honesty, it's been clean, and it's been the most real thing in my life for the past 2 months, which I understand might look like the same problem from the outside. Adelaide picked her mending back up. Tell him tomorrow, she said. Tell Silas. He deserves to know his brother is coming. Hazel looked at the folded letter. I know. You know, and you're still going to think about it for another hour. Probably, Hazel admitted. She did. She told him on the ride out. Not immediately. She'd learned something about Silas over the weeks, which was that he processed things better when they weren't delivered the moment he walked through a door. That he needed the ride, the open land, the pace of the horses to settle into before the heavier things could be heard properly. So she waited until they were well clear of Millhaven, until the town was behind them and the December prairie was wide and cold on all sides, and then she said, I need to tell you something. He looked at her. She told him about the letter. All of it, including the phrase looking out for his interests, which she delivered without editorial comment and let sit in the air between them. Silas rode in silence for a while after she finished. Copper moved steadily beneath him, unbothered, the way horses are unbothered by human trouble. The wind came at them from the north with that particular December quality. Not violent, but entirely without mercy. Harlan, Silas said finally. The name alone, as if testing the weight of it. He didn't say who told him. About me. Doesn't matter who told him. He shifted in the saddle. Harlan's been trying to get me off this land for 4 years. Sends a letter every few months. Same letter mostly, with different words. Wants me to come to Missouri. A pause. He's not a bad man. He's my brother. And he's worried about me, and he's been worried for so long that the worry has started to look like certainty to him. He's certain I'm wasting my life. He's certain this, a brief gesture, taking in the prairie, the direction of the hill, all of it, is unhealthy. And he's decided the way to get me off the land is to find the thing I'm most likely to listen to and push on it. And he thinks I'm that thing. Silas looked at her, apparently. Are you angry? He thought about it honestly, which was what he did with every question worth answering. No, he said. I'm tired. There's a difference. Being angry at Harlan is like being angry at the north wind. He's going to do what he does because that's what he does, and getting worked up about it burns energy I don't have. He looked ahead. What day does he arrive? The letter said Friday. He didn't give an exact time. Silas absorbed this. He'll come to the shop, he said. That's where he'll have been told to find you. He'll want to talk to you before he talks to me. Hazel looked at him. That doesn't bother you? It bothers me, he said. I said I wasn't angry. I didn't say it didn't bother me. They rode the rest of the way to the hill mostly in silence. Not the comfortable silence of the previous weeks. Something tighter than that, something that had an edge to it. When they reached the oak, Silas dismounted and untied the flowers from Copper's bag, and Hazel watched him carry them to the stone with the same deliberate care he always used, and she noticed for the first time that his shoulders were set differently than usual, higher, tighter, the posture of a man carrying something extra. He crouched beside the stone. He set the flowers down. He was quiet longer than usual before he started talking, and when he did, his voice was lower than she'd heard it, and she stayed at her full distance and didn't try to hear the words because they weren't hers to hear. But she noticed that he stayed beside the stone longer than he typically did, and when he stood up, there was something in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not grief. She knew what his grief looked like, or rather she knew how it didn't look, how it had been absorbed so long it sat below the surface. This was something else, something more immediate. He came back to where she stood. He looked at the grave over his shoulder once. I told her about Harlan coming, he said. What did you tell her? I told her I wasn't going to Missouri. He looked at Hazel with the kind of directness that meant he wanted her to hear this clearly. I told her this land is where she is, and where she is where I'm staying, and no amount of Harlan deciding what's good for me is going to change that. He paused. I also told her you'd been keeping me company, and that she was right, that it was better than being alone out here with nothing but stubborn cattle and a fence in the south pasture that still doesn't. The briefest pause, the smallest possible thing in his voice. She knew I'd be all right if somebody was paying attention. She always knew that. Hazel didn't say anything. She looked at the grave and the flowers against the stone and the old oak above it, bare now in December, its branches making a gray lattice against the pale sky. She sounds like she knew you very well, Hazel said finally. Better than I knew myself, Silas said. For most of it. Harlan Granger arrived on Friday as promised. He did not arrive at the shop. He arrived at the ranch. This was, Hazel found out later, because he'd ridden in the night before and gone directly to the livery, where Pete Darrow had been so thoroughly delighted to have information that was actively useful to someone that he'd told Harlan everything he knew inside of 10 minutes, which was considerable. So by the time Friday morning came, Harlan knew about the flowers and the hill and the grave and Hazel and the approximate shape of the past 3 months, which meant he arrived at the ranch already having formed his conclusions and needing only to confront them. Silas told her all of this the following Friday, in the flat recounting manner of a man who has decided that describing something is easier than feeling it again. They'd had the conversation in the kitchen of the ranch, which Silas described as the only room in the house warm enough to have a serious conversation in December without one party developing hypothermia. Harlan was 2 years younger than Silas, which in their dynamic apparently meant nothing. Harlan had always operated as the older brother in every way that counted except chronologically. He was a big man, Silas said. Not tall, but broad, with the look of someone who did more administrative work than physical labor these days, but still remembered that it hadn't always been that way. He had their mother's eyes and their father's habit of going very still when he'd decided he was right about something. He'd gone very still about 30 seconds into telling Silas why he was there. He said, Silas told Hazel, riding toward the hill, that he didn't begrudge me my grief. He said he understood about Clara, or as much as a man can understand something he didn't live through himself. He said 7 years was a long time, but he wasn't going to argue about that because he'd tried and it hadn't worked. Silas's voice had the quality of someone reciting something they intend not to forget. Then he said he'd been hearing about the flower shop girl. He called me that? He did. I corrected him. He noted the correction. A pause. Then he said he was concerned that a young woman with no particular stake in my well-being had installed herself in my routine in a way that was preventing me from moving forward. Moving forward, Hazel said. The phrase had the quality of a rock in a shoe, small and impossible to ignore. That's what he said. Moving forward to what? Missouri? He would say yes. Silas looked straight ahead. He would say to a life that isn't organized around keeping faith with the dead. Hazel was quiet for a moment. What did you say? Silas adjusted his hat brim against the low winter sun. I said that Clara wasn't dead in the way he meant it. That keeping faith with her was what kept me believing anything was worth keeping faith with at all. And if he couldn't see the difference between an obsession and a devotion, then we weren't going to settle it in one morning in a cold kitchen. A beat. He said I was being difficult. Are you being difficult? Probably, he said. I'm not claiming otherwise. But difficult and wrong are different things. They rode for a while in the cold. Did he mention me again? Hazel asked. He said he wanted to meet you. Silas looked at her. I told him that was your decision. He said he'd be staying in Millhaven for a week. I said that was his decision. Hazel turned this over. He's staying a week. He came a long way, Silas said, without inflection. I imagine he's not going back without having done what he came to do. She met Harlan on the Tuesday. He came into the shop at mid-morning, and she knew who he was before he said anything, because he had Silas's height and a version of Silas's stillness that had been applied differently. Where Silas's stillness was patience, Harlan's was assessment. He looked at the shop and at her and at the interior of the space with the quick evaluative quality of a man who is accustomed to making decisions based on limited information. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Granger." She set down what she was doing. She looked at him openly because looking at people openly was both her nature and, in situations like this, a tactical decision. "You've come to talk about your brother." "I have." He looked around the shop once more. "I understand you've been accompanying him every Friday." "I have." "For how long?" "Going on 3 months." He nodded, filing this. "And what is it exactly that you—" He stopped, restarted. "What are you getting from it?" is my question. Hazel was quiet for a moment because the question deserved a real answer rather than the first one that occurred to her. "His company," she said finally. He thinks carefully about things, and he says what he means, and he's honest in a way that most people aren't. I find that valuable." She paused. "And I think he finds it valuable to have someone to tell things to. The ordinary things. He's been told me Clara loved the ordinary things, and I think he's been storing them up with nowhere to put them." Harlan looked at her steadily. "You're not in love with him." It wasn't quite a question. It had the quality of a test. "He's my friend," Hazel said evenly. "You're 26. I know how old I am. He's 45 and he goes to his dead wife's grave every week without fail and has done for 7 years and isn't showing any signs of stopping." Harlan set his hands on the counter. Not aggressively, more in the way of a man who needs somewhere to put them. "I'm not saying he's wrong to do it. I've said things about that before and it doesn't move him. But I'm saying that building your social life around a man who is, in every meaningful sense, still living with his dead wife. That's a complicated thing to be part of. And I think you're too young to understand how complicated." Hazel held his gaze. "I think," she said carefully, "that you're trying to look out for me and for him at the same time, and those two things are pointing in different directions, and that's why you sound so certain when you're actually not." Harlan blinked. The stillness in him shifted slightly. "I'm not asking him to stop going to the Hill," Hazel continued. "I'm not trying to replace Clara or move him forward or get him to Missouri. I ride with him. I listen. I make sure the flowers are good. That's all I do. And if you can look at what that's done for him and call it a complication rather than a kindness, then I think we're seeing a very different man." A long silence. Harlan looked at the flowers in their buckets. At the jar on the window ledge, the battered prairie roses she'd saved 3 months ago were long gone, but she'd kept the jar and put a small cutting of holly in it for December. "He hasn't come to Missouri," Harlan said, and for the first time his voice had something different in it, something that wasn't certainty. "In 4 years. I've asked every way I know how, and I know the land is where she is. I'm not an idiot, but a man can't live on devotion alone." "I don't think he is," Hazel said. "I think he's living on the ranch and the cattle and the seasons and the ordinary things, and the devotion is what gives it shape." Harlan looked at her. "You've got strong opinions about a man you've known 3 months." "He talks to me," she said simply. "People who talk to you honestly, you learn a lot from them quickly." Another silence. This one had a different quality. Not hostile, not convinced, something in between. "Clara trusted people quickly too," Harlan said, and his voice had gone somewhere else. Somewhere older, somewhere that remembered. Silas always said that was how he knew she was braver than him. She could let people in without needing to know everything about them first. Hazel said nothing. She let that sit. Harlan straightened. He looked at his hands on the counter. "I'm not your enemy, Miss Whitmore." "I don't think you are. But I'm not going to pretend I'm not concerned." "I wouldn't want you to," she said. "A man should be concerned about his brother, especially when they're the only family each other has." He looked at her sharply. "He told me," she said, "when we talk." Harlan's jaw shifted slightly. "He told you that?" "He talks about his life honestly. That's part of why I trust him." Harlan picked up his hands from the counter. He reached into his jacket and produced a card. His name, his address in Missouri, the farm. He set it on the counter. "If something changes," he said, "if anything about his situation changes, the ranch, his health, anything, I'd appreciate knowing." Hazel looked at the card. "You should ask him for that," she said. "Not me." Harlan's mouth tightened. "He won't tell me." He might, she said, if you talk to him the way you talked to me just now, without the certainty. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his card and put it back in his pocket. I'll think about that, he said. He left. Hazel released the breath she'd been mostly holding for the past 20 minutes and went to put the kettle on. She found out later from Silas on the following Friday that Harlan had gone back to the ranch on the Wednesday. Not with a prepared speech this time. He'd come, Silas said, in the afternoon, and he'd sat in the kitchen and they'd talked for 3 hours, which was the longest they'd talked since before Clara died. Harlan had said, I don't understand what you're doing, but I think I've been wrong about why you're doing it. Silas had said, that's probably the most you're going to get from me without arguing about it for another 4 years, and I'd rather not. Harlan had laughed. He hadn't laughed with Silas, by Silas's account, in longer than either of them could precisely remember. He'd left for Missouri on Thursday morning. He'd shaken Silas's hand at the door, which was what Granger men did instead of the things they couldn't say. He'd looked at the westward porch and the leaning barn and the plains rolling away to the horizon, and he'd said, You could have gone anywhere, Silas. When you came out here, you picked this. I picked it with Clara, Silas said. I know. Harlan had put his hat on. I know you did. He'd ridden away east toward Missouri, and Silas had watched him go from the porch and felt, he said, the particular complicated grief of being known imperfectly by the person who has known you longest. The kind of grief that doesn't have a resolution because it isn't a problem that can be resolved. It's just the truth of being people who grew up in the same house and then grew in different directions and love each other across the gap. Hazel listened to all of this riding through the December cold. When Silas finished, she said, Are you glad he came? Silas thought about it. Yes, he said, in the way that things you'd rather not go through are still sometimes necessary. That's most things. Most things, he agreed. They reached the hill. The oak was bare against the sky, its branches intricate and dark. The grave was exactly as it always was. The stone, the 4 words, the particular quality of stillness that the hill had in all seasons, as if the land itself had decided something permanent about this spot. Silas laid the flowers against the stone. December lilies, which were harder to come by and which Hazel had sourced from a supplier 2 towns over specifically because she refused to give Silas inferior flowers in winter. He noticed. He always noticed. He talked to Clara about Harlan's visit. He talked about the South Pasture heifer, who had finally made peace with the fence and was, Silas suspected, only waiting for spring to begin dismantling something else. He talked about the morning 2 days ago when the frost on the grass had caught the sunrise at an angle that turned the whole prairie briefly gold, and how he'd stood on the porch and wished she was standing next to him to see it. That was the one that got into Hazel's chest and stayed there. The gold prairie and the porch and the wishing. She turned away and looked at the horizon so he wouldn't see her face, because her face was doing something she hadn't asked it to do. And it wasn't sadness exactly. It was something larger than sadness. Something that was about more than this moment, more than this hill. Something about the whole accumulated weight of what love looked like when it was practiced as a discipline over years, over grief, over every kind of weather the world could produce. When Silas stood up, she had herself arranged again. Or almost. He looked at her. He saw something in her face, she could tell, because he went very still in that particular way. You all right? He said. The frost morning, she said. The gold prairie. That one got me. He looked at her for a moment. It was something, he said quietly. I won't pretend otherwise. They stood on the hill in the winter light and didn't say anything for a moment, and the wind moved through the bare oak branches with a dry sound like paper, and somewhere below them on the plain, a hawk was quartering the grass. Hazel, Silas said. She looked at him. I want you to know. He stopped. He was a man who chose his words carefully because he meant them precisely, and he wouldn't send them out until they were right. What you've been doing, coming with me, the flowers, listening. He looked at the stone. Clara would have said there are debts that can't be paid back, that the only thing you can do with them is carry them well and try to pass something equivalent on when you can. He looked at Hazel. I don't know how to pay this back. It's not a debt, she said. I know, but I wanted to say it anyway. She held his gaze. She made you good at saying the things that matter, she said. Clara did. She made you practice it. Something moved in his face. She was patient about it, he said. It took a while. I imagine most good things do. He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he touched his hat brim, and they untied the horses, and they rode back toward Millhaven in the pale winter afternoon. When they came in off the prairie and down the main street, the town looked different than it had in October. It was the same buildings, the same rutted street, the same sky above it. But some of the people standing outside the general store looked up as they passed and nodded, not with the avid curiosity of before, not with the theory-building speculation. Something quieter than that. Pete Darrow raised a hand from the livery stable doorway and didn't say anything, which from Pete was approximately equivalent to a formal statement. And Margaret Hollis, coming out of the bank with her husband, stopped on the walk and watched them pass and said nothing, but her hands were at her sides this time, not folded in front of her. Hazel registered all of it in the peripheral way she'd been registering the town's attention for months. She didn't perform unawareness, and she didn't perform acknowledgement. She just rode. At the shop she dismounted, and Silas took Patience's reins as he always did. Same time next week, she said. Same time next week, he said. He touched his hat and rode northwest, and the town watched him go, and then went back to its business, and Hazel went inside and took off her coat, and her mother looked up from the counter with an expression that asked a question without using any words. He's all right, Hazel said. Harlan's gone back to Missouri. Adelaide nodded. And you? Hazel hung her coat. She thought about the frost morning and the gold prairie and the porch and the wishing, and the way Silas had looked at the stone and said Clara would have said there are debts that can't be paid back. I'm all right, she said. Her mother looked at her with 30 years of reading people in a flower shop. Mostly, Hazel added. Adelaide seemed to accept that as an accurate accounting. She went back to her work, and Hazel went back to hers. And the December afternoon settled around the shop and the town and the prairie beyond it, cold and enormous, and for the moment, still. Winter settled into Millhaven the way it always did, without apology and without any particular interest in how people felt about it. January came in hard, with 3 days of snow that buried the main street to the horses' knees and kept most people indoors doing the kinds of things people do when the world temporarily stops being traversable. Mending, arguing, thinking too much about things they'd been too busy to think about in the warmer months. Hazel kept the shop open through all of it, partly because her mother's regulars depended on it, and partly because closing felt like surrendering to something she didn't want to surrender to. She ordered extra stock from the supplier 2 towns over, the same one she'd been using for the winter lilies, and she kept the bouquet ready every Friday, regardless of the weather, because Silas had walked through mud in the wrong season with battered fence-line roses, and the least she could do was have something worthy of the hill waiting for him when he got there. He always got there. That was the thing about Silas Granger that Hazel had understood intellectually in October and understood in her bones by January. The man did not stop. Not because he was incapable of stopping. He was not a person defined by stubbornness in the ordinary sense. He stopped when stopping was right. He was patient with cattle and weather and difficult situations and neighbors he found trying. But there were things he'd decided about, and those things he simply continued doing in the way that the creek continued running even in August when it had no business running. Not with drama, not with announcement, just because stopping was not in its nature. He came every Friday. He bought the flowers. They rode to the hill. He talked to Clara. They rode back. And Millhaven watched, and gradually stopped watching in the way it had been watching, and started watching differently. It was Margaret Hollis who named it first, which Hazel found both fitting and surprising. Margaret came in on the second Friday of January, not to buy anything, as was increasingly her habit when she had something to say, and stood at the counter and said, "People have started to respect him." Hazel looked up from her work. "Not in the way they respected him before," Margaret said. "Before they respected him the way you respect something you don't understand, at a distance, a little warily. Now it's different. Now they know what he's doing and why, and it's changed how they see him." She paused. Pete Darrow told someone at the feed store last week that Silas Granger was the most honorable man he'd ever seen, and Pete Darrow has never in his life said anything like that about anyone. "Pete Darrow thinks most people are at best adequate," Hazel said. "Exactly. So." Margaret folded her hands, but differently than she used to, less like a woman arriving at a conclusion, more like a woman sitting with something she was still working out. I think what you've done by going with him, by making it something that could be seen, I think it let people understand it. They couldn't see it before. It was just a man buying flowers and disappearing. Now it has a shape. Hazel considered this. I didn't do it to give it a shape. I know you didn't. That's rather why it worked. Margaret looked at the window, at the frost on the lower corners of the glass. I've been thinking about what you said. In the fall, when I came in, about measuring the wrong things. She looked back at Hazel. I've been trying to measure differently. It's harder than it sounds. Most things that are actually worth doing are, Hazel said. Margaret accepted this without pushback, which was its own kind of measure of how much had changed. She left without buying anything, as Hazel had expected, and Hazel watched her go and thought about shapes, about the idea that things only become comprehensible when someone does the work of making them visible, and about the accidental nature of how that had happened here. She hadn't gone with Silas to make his devotion visible. She'd gone because she wanted to understand it, and then because she found his company worth having, and then because Friday mornings on the prairie with the cold air and Patience's steady gait had become the part of the week she moved toward rather than through. But Margaret wasn't wrong that something had changed. Clem Darby was the part of it that didn't resolve cleanly, because real things rarely do. He'd stopped coming into the shop. This was, on balance, less painful than his continued presence would have been, but it had a quality of incompleteness to it, an unfinished sentence that she'd have preferred to have finished even if the ending was difficult. She saw him occasionally on the street, and he nodded with the careful courtesy of someone who had decided that courtesy was what he could manage and was managing it deliberately. She nodded back. They did not speak. She heard from Ida from the general store that Clem had been talking to a woman in Dodge City he'd met through a cousin, and that things seemed to be progressing in that direction. Hazel found she was genuinely glad about this, which told her something about the nature of what had been between them, nothing deep enough to make his happiness difficult, which was the kindest possible outcome. She saw him in February on a Thursday afternoon, coming out of the bank just as she was walking past on an errand. They both stopped. The usual careful nod, and then, she wasn't sure why, except that incompleteness had been bothering her in a low-grade persistent way for 2 months. She said, "Clem, I'm glad you're doing well." He looked at her. He looked, she thought, like a man who had put something down that he'd been carrying and was still getting used to not having the weight. "You too, Hazel." A pause. "I shouldn't have," he started. "You didn't do anything unforgivable," she said. "You were honest about what you wanted, and you didn't handle it perfectly. That's most people." He seemed to need a moment with that. "The woman in Dodge City," he said, and he didn't ask how she knew. "Millhaven. She's coming up to visit next month. I hope it goes well." "Thank you." He said it simply, without performance. Then, "He's a good man, Silas Granger. I said things about him I shouldn't have. When I was—" He stopped. "I was being small. I know that." Hazel looked at him. He was 29 and doing his best with the information he had, which was what most people were doing most of the time. "He's a good man," she said. "You could come and see the flowers sometime, if you wanted to understand it better." Clem shook his head. "I think that's yours," he said. "Whatever it is. I think that belongs to you." She watched him go back up the street. She stood on the walk for a moment in the February cold, the wind at the back of her neck, and she thought about what he'd said. "Whatever it is. I think that belongs to you." She wasn't sure what to do with that. She put it away for later and went about her errand. It was in March that Silas told her about the decision. They were on the ride back from the hill. Early March, the first morning of the year that felt like something other than winter, a tentative softening in the air that the prairie acknowledged with the first faint green at the bases of the dry grass stems. It was the kind of morning that made you want to be cautious about hoping for too much, because Kansas could take it back without notice. Silas had been quieter than usual on the ride up, and Hazel had let it sit because she'd learned by now the difference between his silence that was comfortable and his silence that was working something through. On the way back, he said, "I'm going to expand the herd." She waited. "I've been running about 80 head, he said. "I've got the land for 120, maybe 130, if the South pasture cooperates. I had a man contact me about buying calves from an operation down near Wichita. Good stock. It would mean a significant outlay this spring and a lot of work through the summer. He looked straight ahead. It also means I'd need help. I can't run 130 head alone. You're going to hire someone. I've been thinking about it for 2 years, he said. I kept not doing it. I told myself it was the expense, or the timing. He paused. I think it was more that having someone on the property every day meant the place had to be for something other than what it's been. Hazel let that sit for a moment. Then, carefully, what has it been? He wrote in silence for a bit. A place I maintain, he said, for Clara's sake, in her memory, because she loved it. He looked at the prairie, at the early green bases of the grass, at the enormous sky above it. But Hazel, I've been thinking since Harlan came, not about Missouri, I'm not going to Missouri, but about what Clara actually meant when she made me promise not to let the loneliness harden me. She didn't say, preserve the ranch as a monument. She said, keep giving something to somebody. Keep being open. You think hiring a hand is being open? I think it's being practical, he said, which Clara would have said was the same thing. The smallest movement at the corner of his mouth. I think it means I'm deciding the ranch is a place where things happen, not just a place things happened, and that's... He stopped, started again. That took me 7 years and I'm not going to pretend it didn't. Hazel looked at him. He was 45 years old and his face carried all the weather he'd lived through, and he was making a decision that was small on the surface and enormous underneath. And he was making it on the back of a horse in early spring with the first green of the year coming up through the dead grass of last season. Clara would be glad, Hazel said. He looked at her. You think so? She made you promise not to calcify. Hiring a hand is the opposite of calcifying. He considered that. She'd have found someone unsuitable to hire on purpose, he said, just to see how I handled it. That was her way. She'd test you with something difficult and then be prouder than she let on when you figured it out. Hazel laughed. A real one, the kind that came without permission. She sounds exhausting. She was, he said, with something in his voice that was so clearly love it couldn't be called anything else. She was the best kind of exhausting. They rode into Mill Haven in the early spring morning, and something had shifted, though Hazel couldn't have named the precise nature of the shift until later. It was something about the word for something going from past tense to present tense, even if the subject of that word was still gone. Clara wasn't becoming less gone, but the ranch was becoming more alive, and those were two separate things moving in the same direction. The hired hand arrived in April. His name was Denny Oakes, and he was 22 and had grown up on cattle ranches in Colorado and had come to Kansas following a girl who had subsequently declined to be followed, which left him in Hays County with skills and no particular reason to leave. He was gap-toothed and fast-talking and had more energy than any one person needed, and within 2 weeks he and Silas had established a working rhythm that was, by Silas's account, already better for the cattle than the previous 7 years of solo management had been. Silas told Hazel this on the Friday ride with the particular reluctant satisfaction of a man who has been proven right about something he'd been wrong to delay. He's already found 3 things I'd been doing inefficiently, Silas said. He was polite about it, mostly. You let him say it? I listened, Silas said. Clara always said the hardest part of being capable is admitting when someone younger does something better. I've been working on it. For how long? Since Clara told me. So, 20 years, give or take. He looked at Hazel. Some lessons take. She looked out over the April prairie, which was doing what the April prairie did, coming back to itself. The grass greening with a speed that always felt slightly implausible after the long winter gray. The sky going to a deeper blue. The wind carrying something warmer in it than it had for months. Patience moved beneath her with a slightly livelier step than she had in December, and Hazel thought that horses had the right idea about seasons. There's something I've been wanting to tell you, Silas said. He said it the way he said things he'd been considering for a while. Not abruptly, but with that careful quality of language that had been prepared in advance and was now being delivered precisely. Hazel waited. When I came into the shop in October, he said, and you asked me who the flowers were for, I almost didn't answer. I know, I saw you almost not answer. I'd been carrying it alone for 7 years, he said. That's a long time to carry something alone. You get You get used to the shape of it, the way it fits inside you, and when you imagine telling someone, it sounds... He stopped. It sounds like something that would change when it was said out loud, like it might become something other than what it is. Did it? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said, but it became bigger. In a way that was... He looked at the horizon. I was afraid that saying it would make it small, the way things sometimes get smaller when you put them into words because words aren't the right size for them. But it didn't. It got bigger because you... He stopped again, and for the first time in Hazel's experience of him, he seemed genuinely uncertain how to proceed. You took it seriously, he said finally. You didn't make it strange or sad or impressive. You just took it as what it was. Hazel felt the back of her throat tighten in a way she'd learned to manage over the months of Fridays. That's because it was what it was, she said. You didn't need me to make it anything. No, he said. But you needed to not make it less. And you didn't. And I didn't. He adjusted his hat, which was a gesture she recognized now as the one he made when he was being more honest than he'd planned. I didn't know how much I'd needed that until you did it. They rode in silence for a while after that. Comfortable silence. The April kind. The conversation she'd been putting off having with herself arrived the way those conversations always do. Not at a convenient moment and not with any particular announcement. It arrived on a Thursday night in late April, while she was closing the shop alone, her mother having gone to bed early, the street outside gone quiet. She was wrapping stems for the next morning's delivery, and she was thinking, as she had been thinking in some background portion of her mind for several months, about what Clem Darby had said. Whatever it is, I think that belongs to you. She thought about what it was. It was not love in the conventional sense. She was clear-eyed enough about herself to know the difference between genuine love and the particular tender attachment you form to someone whose integrity you admire and whose grief you've been trusted with. She cared about Silas Granger. She cared about him in the way you care about someone you've ridden 11 miles across a Kansas prairie with in every kind of weather, someone who has shown you the inside of his life without flinching, someone who has given you his honesty every Friday for 6 months. But what she felt for him was not the thing he felt for Clara. It could not be and was not meant to be. Clara's place in Silas's life was not a vacancy. It was a presence, specific and irreplaceable, and Hazel had never for one moment confused proximity to that presence with the thing itself. What she felt was something else. She thought about what Adelaide had said back in October, the kind of story that pulls at you, makes you want to be part of it. She'd been part of it. She was still part of it. And the question she had been not quite asking herself for months was whether being part of it was enough, or whether she wanted something of her own that it couldn't give her. The honest answer, working through it in the empty shop with the stems in her hands and the smell of spring flowers around her, was both things were true. She wanted to keep going to the hill. She also knew that she was 26 and that Fridays with Silas, whatever they were not a life. They were a part of a life, an important part, but a part. She thought about that for a long time. When she went upstairs, Adelaide was not entirely asleep. Hazel. I'm all right, Mama. I know. A pause from the back bedroom. I just wanted to say, what you've been doing this year, with him. It was right. Whatever else you figure out, that part was right. Hazel stood in the dark of the small kitchen. Outside the window, the April night was clear and cold, the stars very bright and very far away. I know, she said. Summer came and the ranch expanded, and Denny Oaks learned to put his fence posts in at 10 feet after one conversation with Silas about the matter, and the South Pasture heifer, the one who had spent the better part of a year dismantling every barrier placed between herself and wherever she wanted to be, produced a calf in June that Silas described to Clara on the following Friday as the most determined small creature he'd ever seen, which was probably hereditary. The Fridays continued. What changed was small but real. Hazel began talking on the rides too, not just asking questions, not just listening, talking, about the shop, about her mother's health, which had stabilized into something manageable, about a book she'd read, about things she noticed and stored up through the week in the way she'd always done but now had somewhere to put. Silas listened the way he did everything, with full attention and without interruption and with occasional responses that were worth waiting for. He said once, On a July morning when she'd been talking about a recurring argument she had with a supplier about the quality of summer roses. You argue the way Clara used to argue. Not louder when you're not being heard, clearer. Hazel looked at him. Is that a compliment or a comparison? Both, he said. They're not exclusive. She thought about that all the way to the hill. She thought about it again, later, and understood that it was the kind of thing you could only say to someone when you were sure they understood what Clara's name in your mouth meant. Not displacement, not confusion, but the highest acknowledgement one person can make of another person, which is, you remind me of the best things. In September, just past the first anniversary of the Friday. Hazel had asked her question. Adelaide Whitmore came back behind the counter full-time. She did it without announcement, appearing one Monday morning in her apron with the expression of a woman who has decided that convalescing has its limits and she has reached them. She rearranged 3 buckets, corrected the angle of the front window display, and made a cup of tea, and the shop resumed being properly Adelaide's shop with Hazel in it, rather than Hazel's shop that Adelaide lived above. Hazel didn't mind. She'd been minding for her mother for a year and she was glad not to be. What it meant practically was that Friday mornings became easier. Adelaide could open, could handle the early customers, could be the shop in the way that Adelaide was the shop, and Hazel could prepare the flowers and ride out with a less divided attention. On the first Friday of Adelaide's return, Hazel came downstairs at 7:30 to find her mother already behind the counter, already working, the bouquet for Silas already being prepared with the careful attention of a woman who had known this ritual was coming and had decided she wanted a hand in it. Hazel stopped in the doorway. Adelaide was choosing the lilies herself, examining each stem, making decisions with the same thoroughness Hazel had inherited. The prairie roses she was selecting for color, reaching past the paler ones for the deeper pinks. She felt her daughter looking at her and didn't look up. "I know which ones he prefers," she said. "I've been watching for a year." Hazel leaned against the doorframe. "Mama." "I never asked who they were for either," Adelaide said. "For years I never asked. I just wrapped them and took his money and told myself it wasn't my business." She finished the bouquet. She tied the twine with a precise knot that was slightly more careful than necessary. "I'd like to have a part in it now, if that's all right." Hazel crossed the shop and stood beside her and looked at the bouquet on the counter. White lilies, deep pink prairie roses, wrapped in clean brown paper, tied with clean twine. "He won't know the difference," Hazel said. "I'll know," Adelaide said simply. But the October morning that changed things came without particular warning, which was how the things that actually matter tend to arrive. Hazel was in the shop at 8 when Copper appeared on the main street without his rider. The horse walked in from the northwest at his usual steady pace, which was so much Silas's pace that the wrongness of it took a moment to register. He came down the center of the street with his reins trailing, not in distress, not running, just walking, the way a horse walks when it knows the way and has been pointed in the right direction and then left to find it. He stopped at the hitching post in front of Whitmore's flower shop and stood. No Silas. Hazel came out onto the walk. She looked at the horse. She looked down the street toward the northwest edge of town and saw nothing. The bouquet was still in her hands. She'd been checking the twine when she heard the hoofbeats. Pete Darrow came out of the livery at a near run, which was not a thing Pete Darrow did. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and the quality of his voice made her stomach go cold. "When did he come in?" she said. "Just now, just this moment." Hazel looked at the horse. She looked at the flowers in her hands. She looked at Pete and understood that he understood what this meant as well as she did. "I need a horse," she said. Pete had one saddled in under 4 minutes, which was either the fastest he'd ever moved in his professional life or close to it. She rode northwest. She found him on the prairie 3 miles out from the hill. He was on the ground beside the trail, which had been churned by something recent, a stumble, Copper putting a foot wrong in the soft autumn ground. Silas was sitting up when she reached him, which was enough to unknot the worst of the fear, but he was sitting up in the way of someone who has tried to stand and cannot, his left leg at an angle that told her everything before he said anything. "The leg," he said when she came off the horse. "I can see." "Copper's fine. I know, he's at the post. I'll get you back to town." She crouched beside him, assessed the angle, looked at his face. Pale, tight. The particular controlled expression of a man who is in significant pain and is not going to say so more than once. Can you get up with help? Not on that leg. Then we wait for help to come. She'd already made her decision. She'd grown up watching her mother manage situations that required immediate calm, and she discovered now that this had been an education. She pulled off her coat without discussion and put it around his shoulders because October mornings were cold and shock made them colder. He accepted the coat without argument, which told her he was hurting more than he was letting on. I missed the Friday, he said. Silas. I know. He looked down at his leg with an expression that was half frustration and half something else, something that had nothing to do with the leg. I know, it's just, I've never missed a Friday, not once. She looked at him. She looked at the trail ahead, in the direction of the hill, and back at him. She looked at the flowers she'd set on the ground beside her when she dismounted. She'd carried them out of pure reflex, still holding them when she got on the horse. She picked them up. Tell me what you'd tell her, she said. Silas looked at her. The week, Hazel said. Tell me what you'd tell her and I'll go. I know the way. Something happened in his face that she couldn't name. It was not grief exactly. It was the look of someone being handed something they didn't know they were allowed to need. Hazel, you've been telling her the ordinary things for 7 years. Tell me, and I'll take them. She held the flowers out in front of her with both hands. This is what it means. You said it yourself. The giving is the thing that keeps you open. You can give it to me today. He was quiet for a long time. The October morning moved around them, the dry grass, the sky going blue above it, a hawk somewhere that she heard but didn't see. Then, quietly, he told her. He told her about a heifer born to the South pasture cow that had been difficult since spring, a small heifer, black with a white mark above the eye, that Denny had found on Monday morning and had been watching with the particular attention of someone who wasn't going to say the word worried out loud, but was. The heifer had made it by Thursday. Denny had been insufferably pleased about this, and Silas had been pleased and not said so, which balanced out. He told her about the creek, which was lower than it should be in October, a concern for the coming winter, worth watching. He told her the frost had come in earnest 2 nights ago, and the grass in the morning had that crystalline quality that made the prairie look like a different country. He told her about a morning 3 days ago when the light came up across the plains in a particular way, and he'd stood on the porch with his coffee and thought, as he always thought, that she would have loved it. He told her that. He told her that Denny had found a book somewhere and was reading in the evenings, which Silas had not anticipated and found he didn't entirely mind. He told her the barn door still hung slightly wrong, and he and Denny had discussed it and both decided it could wait till spring, which Clara would have found predictable. He told her about the winter stores, the hay, the fencing work done in August, the things prepared and the things still to prepare. He told her the small things. Hazel listened to every word. Then she took the flowers, and she looked at him one more time, and she rode northwest to the hill. The hill was unchanged. The oak above it had turned, the leaves deep gold and copper, and the stone at its base had the same stillness she'd seen every Friday for a year. She dismounted and walked up the short rise and crouched beside the stone, the way she'd seen Silas crouch beside it 100 times, and she set the flowers carefully against it. The white lilies, the deep pink roses, her mother's knot in the twine. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said out loud, to the stone and the hill and the old oak going gold above it, the heifer made it. Denny was pleased. The creek is low, and there was frost this week, and the morning light 3 days ago was something he wishes you'd seen. She paused. He's all right. He'll be all right. His leg's going to take some time, but he'll be all right. She sat there for a moment, not talking, just there. The wind moved through the oak leaves with a sound like a slow breath. The prairie stretched south and flat and enormous. She thought about the 4 words on the stone. She thought about what it meant to love the ordinary things, not just to tolerate them or endure them, but to love them. To understand that the ordinary things were the thing itself, that the extraordinary moments were constructed of them, that a life worth mourning was always a life full of the daily, the small, the unremarkable made remarkable by consistent attention. She thought about all the things she'd learned in a year of Fridays. How to listen without steering, how to be present without taking up more space than was yours, how to take something seriously without making it heavier. She thought about this fact that she was 26 and crouched at the grave of a woman she'd never met and felt closer to her than to most people she'd known for years. That was Clara's doing, she thought. That was what you left behind when you were the kind of person who made the people around you better at being human. You didn't just leave an absence, you left a shape, and the people who came after were formed by the shape without ever having met you. You did a good thing with him, Hazel said quietly to the stone. And I think he's done all right by the promise. I think you'd say so. She stood up. She adjusted the flowers once against the stone. She rode back. Silas's leg healed over 8 weeks, which was faster than the doctor said and slower than Silas thought was acceptable. Denny ran the ranch during that time with the competent irreverence of someone who was 22 and incapable of treating any situation as irredeemably serious, which turned out to be exactly what was needed. He reported to Silas every evening with the thoroughness of a man who understood instinctively that the boss needed to be kept in the picture, and Silas listened and advised and occasionally argued and found, to his reluctant admission, that Denny was managing better than adequately. The Fridays continued with modifications. Hazel went alone to the hill the first 2 Fridays. She carried the flowers, and she told Clara the week, the way Silas had told her to tell her, the small things, the ordinary things, the things that were the substance of the life he was still living. She did this not because Silas asked her to, but because she could see it was what the ritual required, and the ritual was not hers, but she could carry it when it needed carrying. On the 3rd Friday, Silas came with her on a borrowed wagon. His leg still splinted, but improved enough that sitting on a flat surface was manageable. They tied Patience to the back and Copper to the front and made it to the hill slowly, and Silas went to the stone with a crutch that he used with the reluctant dignity of a man who had never needed one before. And he set the flowers himself. And he talked to Clara. He talked to her about 8 weeks of lying still when he didn't want to be lying still. He talked to her about Denny, who had found the book situation, about the heifer with the white mark, who was thriving in the October cold, about the south pasture fence, which had remained intact through the summer and into the fall, which Silas took as evidence that it had finally reached an understanding with the landscape. He talked about the 8 Fridays he'd missed, not the way you talk about a failure, but the way you talk about a fact you've made your peace with. And he talked about Hazel going to the hill for him. He said it once, briefly, without elaboration, and the quality of his voice when he said it was something that Hazel, standing at her usual distance, filed away without looking at too closely. When they rode back, slowly, the wagon wheels finding every rut in the October trail, he said, "She said thank you." Hazel looked at him. "Clara, I know that's not—" He stopped. "I know she can't say anything. I know that. But when I told her, something settled in me. That's the only way I can put it. Something settled that had been unsettled for 8 weeks." He looked at the prairie. "I think that's what she would have said, if she could." Hazel looked straight ahead. "That's enough," she said. "That's what you needed it to be." By the following spring, the second spring since Hazel had first asked her question, the spring when the South Pasture heifer's calf turned 1 year old, and the creek came back up to where it was supposed to be, and Denny found a second book. Something in Millhaven had quietly changed. It wasn't dramatic. The dramatic version would have been some ceremony, some public moment, some formal acknowledgement. But that wasn't how real things changed in small towns. They changed in the accumulation of small gestures. Pete Darrow started raising his hand whenever Silas rode through, then started coming out to the hitching post. The quilting circle had moved from speculation to something closer to pride. The way communities become proud of the things within them that turn out to be worthy of it. Margaret Hollis had contributed to the flowers every month since she'd asked, and never mentioned it, and Hazel honored that. Clem Darby had married his woman from Dodge City in February. Hazel had sent flowers for the wedding. Adelaide was back behind the counter, which was where she'd always belonged. And Silas Granger came every Friday at 9:05, and the town knew what it meant, and treated it accordingly. One Friday in April, a woman Hazel didn't recognize came into the shop while she was preparing the bouquet. She was perhaps 60, passing through from somewhere east, and she looked at the shop with the open curiosity of a traveler who has no expectations. "Those are beautiful," she said, looking at the lilies and the deep pink roses. "Thank you," Hazel said. "Who are they for?" Hazel tied the twine. She thought about the question. The same question she'd asked a year and a half ago, and what had happened because she asked it. She thought about Clara's grave on the hill, and the 4 words, and Silas's hands receiving the bouquet every Friday with the same gravity he brought to everything that mattered. A woman named Clara, she said. She died 17 years ago. Her husband brings her flowers every week because she loved them and because he made her a promise. The woman looked at her. That's a long time to keep a promise. It is, Hazel said. Does he still love her? Hazel looked at the flowers on the counter, at the work of her hands and her mother's hands, and in a small way, Margaret Hollis's money and Pete Darrow's quiet respect and the whole accumulated weight of what a town had learned to do with something it had first not understood. More clearly than ever, she said. I think he loves her more clearly now than he did at the beginning, because he knows better now what it cost and what it meant. The woman bought a small bunch of carnations for herself and left. The bell above the door settled. The shop was quiet. Hazel stood with the bouquet in her hands, white lilies and deep pink prairie roses tied with twine, brown paper, exactly right, and thought about what her mother had said a long time ago now, that some things feel like they belong to a person, that asking would be taking something. She'd asked anyway. She was glad she had. Outside, Copper appeared on the main street at his usual time, coming in from the northwest, at the same steady pace he had always come, carrying the same man he always carried, the man with the battered brown hat and the large, careful hands and the 7, no, now 8, years of Fridays behind him, and however many ahead. Hazel set the bouquet on the counter where he could reach it without waiting. She put on her coat. She put on her gloves. Left first, then right. The bell rang. Silas came in. He looked at her. He looked at the flowers. He looked at the coat and the gloves. Ready, she said. He picked up the bouquet. He paid without counting the money, as he always did. He held the door. They rode northwest together into the April morning, into the open land, into the ordinary day that was the substance of everything, and behind them Millhaven went about its business, and ahead of them the hill waited with its oak and its stone and its 4 carved words, and the prairie grass was green again at the roots, and the sky was the hard bright blue of early spring in Kansas, and Patience walked steadily beneath Hazel with the calm of an animal that knows where it is going and has learned after all this time to trust the weight it carries.